Hello, friends of Oak Hills. This is Pastor Dale with our weekly video Touchpoint. Today is Thursday, June 20th, 2024. Our Points to Ponder article is titled, House Rules for the Household of Faith. This is part 5 of the 6-part series on Paul's first letter to Timothy. This personal letter gives us clear teaching on how the gospel transforms our lives and the church. I encourage you to read through 1 Timothy with this series. Today we are looking at chapter 5. Have you ever seen one of those house rules signs in someone's house? Perhaps you even have one in your own home. Some signs focus on how to treat the things in the home. If you open it, close it. If you turn it on, turn it off, etc. Some focus on how you treat other people in the home. Say please and thank you. Listen to your parents. Use kind words, etc. And still others focus on keeping things light. Laugh a lot, try new things, make mistakes, play games, etc., etc. We can say that 1 Timothy 5 is kind of like the house rules for the household of faith or the household of God. As we have observed in this study of 1 Timothy, Paul writes to his apprentice, Timothy, in order to explain how the gospel guides the church and how it ought to behave, as he says in chapter 3, verse 15. The gospel ought to shape the teaching of the church, chapter 1, the outward face of the church, chapter 2, the character of the church and her leaders, chapter 3, and service or servants of the church, chapter 4. In chapter 5, Paul now gives some general instructions for how the members of the church should care for one another. Or in other words, house rules for the household of faith. Let me highlight 5 of them. Number 1, treat one another like family. In verses 1 and 2, Paul lays out the relational dynamic to be experienced within the church community. Older men and women should be encouraged and respected like fathers and mothers. Younger men and women should be treated with respect and purity like brothers and sisters. We can spend significant time unpacking how countercultural these 2 verses are. The nutshell is that the gospel transforms us so that we do not self-promote, we do not objectify people, and we do not idolize youthfulness. The gospel empowers us to see other people as God sees them. Number 2, children, care for your aging parents. In verses 3 through 16, Paul gives guidance for how to care for widows in the church community. Before he talks about the church caring for widows, that's house rule number 3, he says children and even grandchildren should care for their aging parents and grandparents and not expect the church to do so. Verse 8 is a very significant, even heavy statement. Paul writes, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Paul is saying that if children do not care for their aging parents, they are, quote, worse than an unbeliever. I think this also applies to parents and or spouses who neglect to provide for their children or their spouses. As we let the gospel take root in our hearts, selfish living will die away. A self-centered lifestyle. And that's what's behind these exhortations from Paul. Children being self-centered and in neglecting their parents. A self-centered lifestyle is evidence that one is resisting the gospel in one's heart. Number 3, the church should care for the elderly who are alone. After clarifying that children have the primary responsibility to care for the elderly and their families, Paul instructs the care for widows who are alone. This applies to any elderly person in the church who needs assistance. The church should be like family to these who are without family. Number 4, honor your spiritual shepherds. In verses 17 through 19, Paul gives instruction on how to honor the elders of the church. The elders are the spiritual shepherds and leaders for the church. Those who rule well should be, quote, considered worthy of double honor. The writer of Hebrews explains what this honor may look like. In chapter 13, verse 17, he writes, "Obey your leaders and submit to them. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning." In 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul lays down the principle for paying the wages for those elders who, quote, labor in preaching and teaching, close quote. And number 5, rebuke unrepentant sin. Paul closes out the chapter with a focus on rebuking unrepentant sin. Well, actually, the rebuke is for those, quote, Paul says, who persist in sin. Members of the church who do not repent of sin, for that is what it means to persist in sin, to be unrepentant, should be rebuked. Like, once again, this is highly countercultural. People do not want to be held accountable, but the gospel humbles us to see our own weakness and hence our need for the church and for such accountability. Membership vows here at Oak Hills reflect the house rules for the church community that we see in 1 Timothy 5. Our members vow to support the church in its worship and work to the best of one's ability and to submit oneself to the government and discipline of the church and promise to study its peace and purity. These vows encompass the biblical commands to love one another, respect one another, care for one another, and submit to one another and your leaders. House rules are good and needed for the church. A few things to highlight in the life of Oak Hills this week. Coming to the end of June. Number 1, our missionaries of the month are John and Tricia Dunning, serving with RUF ministry on the K-State campus. Please continue to be praying for them. Number 2, this Sunday, June 23rd, we are holding a pancake breakfast fundraiser for our Sacred Road missions team that Pastor John is leading. Their missions trip is in July 13th through the 20th. And so we're helping support them, encourage them. Come early to church. Pancakes are going to be served beginning at 9:15 and up until 10:15. So come at any time during that time. Enjoy some pancakes before the worship service, and then join your church family for worship. And then the last thing I'm going to highlight today is that my sabbatical begins in 11 days. Did I calculate? No, it's 10 days. I should keep that countdown up to date. It's 10 days from now. I will be on sabbatical for the months of July and August, which means I will not be assuming and filling my responsibilities as pastor of the church, and I'll be using those 2 months for personal renewal, refreshment, study, and just being re-energized for the calling that God has placed on my life to serve our church, Oak Hills, faithfully as your pastor. As part of that, I will be traveling to Ethiopia, July 5th through the 20th. I'll be in Ethiopia, and then I'll be traveling to Cluj, Romania on the way back. So July 20th to the 25th, I'll be in Cluj, Romania. I appreciate your prayers for me, for that trip, for safety, for the effectiveness of the ministry. I'll be teaching ministers, ministry leaders in Ethiopia, seeking to equip them to study the Pauline epistles and to interpret them and to apply them and teach them in their own ministry context. So pray for the fruitfulness. And then in Cluj, I'm visiting with Chase and Shaw Johnson, missionaries that we support. Pray that I would be an encouragement to them and just visiting with them and seeing firsthand their ministry efforts in Cluj. And then I'll be back home here in the States for the rest of my sabbatical and using that time for my study and refreshment. So appreciate your prayers for that. Keep that in mind. For Touchpoint, our elders are going to be teaming up and taking turns writing each week. But because of our elders are rotating who's writing, we are not going to continue the video Touchpoint for July and August. Lord willing, we'll resume video Touchpoint in September. Well, thank you for joining us this week for our weekly Touchpoint. I look forward to being with you for worship this Sunday. God bless.